Now for today's program. David Strathairn received a Best Actor Academy Award nomination for his portrayal of CBS newsman Edward R. Murrow in the film Good Night and Good Luck. Other film credits include Nightmare Alley, Nomadland, Lincoln, 8 Men Out, and City of Hope, among many others. Theater credits include Scorched and Unearth the Lintel. David is currently starring in the play Remember This, the Lesson of Jan Karski. Derek Goldman is chair of Georgetown University's Department of Performing Arts and director of the Theater and Performance Studies program. He is also the co-founding director of the Laboratory for Global Performance and Politics. His award-winning work has been seen at theaters such as Steppenwolf, Lincoln Center, and the Kennedy Center, among others, and he is the founding director of the Global Network of Higher Education in the Performing Arts. Derek is the co-writer and director of Remember This, the Lesson of Jan Karski. Joining David and Derek today is Amy E. Schwartz, Moment's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Studies Center in Washington, D.C. Before I hand the program over to Amy, we're going to watch a short reel about the play Remember This, the Lesson of Jan Karski.
We have a duty, a responsibility to do something, anything. And if so, how do we know what to do?
So powerful, and so amazing, and so timely right now.
It sounds like Karski, looks like Karski, it feels like Karski.
I thought you were Jan Karski. I knew him, I wrote him, oh, I knew him every day.
So thank you for continuing to tell this story.
It's just really, really powerful to be back in a live theater with human beings, so thank you for being here.
For me, this is a lesson. There is no such thing as good nations, bad nations. Each individual has infinite capacity to do good and infinite capacity to do evil. We have a choice.
One-man show sort of cracked open this communal theatrical experience of David and his scene partners, you all.
The way he asked those questions, the vulnerability and the urgency really hit me right here. I really feel charged and empowered to really search for those answers.
When we see things happen that are not right, to remember this and to do something.
When everything looks hopeless, you're the hope.
Made me to rethink things, and I encouraged me also to say, this is not lost, we need to keep having the conversation. How do we change it? How do we never forget?
We should be careful that we're not allowing it to repeat.
And that is where storytelling comes in.
It left that very much open-ended and encouraged people to ask questions.
What would you do? What can we do?
It's not like we don't have any power or it's futile to even try. What is important is trying.
Wow. Welcome, everybody. Thank you again. Thank you, David, and thank you, Derek, for making the time to talk about this wonderful, wonderful play and tribute to Jan Karski. It's almost, I feel almost it's a silly question for me to start with, because from, like a lot of people, I think from the first time I saw the reference to Karski on Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, I was, obsessed with this guy. But tell me, of all the Holocaust stories that are told, of all the things there are to tell and remember, what was it that drew you to this one? What do you think this story gives us? Maybe Derek, you could talk about
absolutely.
That at first.
Thanks, Amy. It's great to be here with Moment, and thanks for having us. I think the answer is both a little bit serendipitous and circumstantial, but then also very substantive in terms of what has kind of kept us intensely passionate about this particular story. I had a long, deep background as a Holocaust educator and with material like this, but it was really in 2014 when the Karski Centennial was being celebrated at Georgetown, and I was, had been a faculty member there, that I was invited to put something together. And I, knew the outlines of Karski's story, but it was not, that was the initiating occasion. So it was a very particular context in that, like, even when we were creating that very first version, which was a concert reading with David as Karski and a group of students performing with him, we were in dialogue and proximity with a whole community of people who already had cared about Karski, who had Karski as a professor at Georgetown, et cetera.
For this audience, could you just give the headline of the story about Karski?
I can. Karski was born in Łódź in 1914 and was a member of the Polish underground, a courier for the Polish government in exile during World War II. His job was to report on conditions of Nazi-occupied Poland to government leaders in France and later to London and eventually the United States. He met with Jewish leaders in Poland who begged them to be their messenger to report to the Allied nations and about the Holocaust while there was still time to stop it. He agreed. He walked through the Warsaw Ghetto in disguise and later a transit camp in Izbika Lubelska, where he bore witness to the horrors of the genocide. And then he reported to, among others, British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, and eventually President Roosevelt himself. And his reports were met with disinterest or denial or disbelief, depending on how one looked at it. And he remained in the United States and here in Washington at Georgetown, where he became a professor of political science and government for several decades. And people didn't know his story until Claude Lanzmann found him in 1978 when he was filming Shoah and persuaded Karski to tell his story. And after that time, he kind of continued to do so. So it was a story of heroic moral courage and but also of silence and of the trauma of those experiences and events, and of having his own story gradually brought to the surface later in his life. Mm-hmm. And I guess to just briefly to answer the initiating question, because we filled that in, I think that the interest in this story has just continued to be for us its sense of immediacy and relevance, not just as a historical narrative, but because the legacy of Karski's lessons are so much about individual responsibility, about moral conscience, about, as someone who committed his life to teaching. His interest was about the power of the individual and what we can, and choice and agency, and the importance of truth, as someone who carried a truth that he felt he was a failure in making, the impact with that he wanted to. He really, was a beacon of the power of truth. So for us, the privilege of working on this play, especially with so many students around and developing a curriculum around it, has been, I think, to not just look back on a particular historical time, but to really apply Karski's lessons to the moment.
So choice, agency, and truth. Those seem like values for our time, if there ever were any. David, what is it, your portrayal? I mean, you're meeting such a high bar because the actual Karski is on screen at the beginning of the play every night, and then you step into the role. What called to you about Karski? I mean, what is it that you bring out?
What I try to bring out is he's so compelling in so many ways. I think the thing that most motivates me or compels me or drives me is his sense of contribution to not only the world at large, but as he tried during World War II, but thereafter to his students, And I often feel that a creative arts, whatever discipline, whether it's poetry or painting or dance, theater, whatever, is a teaching tool. And he himself was quite demonstrative, quite acted out things in his classroom. So he had this innate performative essence that that allows me to perform him. I feel that I am doing that in respect of him, and yet the thing that pulls me forward each night is knowing that there is an audience out there, and for the most part, a young audience who doesn't know of him, who may be able to use this piece as a platform for themselves to find a way in to make a contribution, to give them some inspiration, however minuscule it may be, for them to be inspired to do what he did, which was to bear witness, tell the truth, and in a very Socratic way, give it up to the audience, to the people who are listening, for them to reckon with his story and what he represents.
Socratic in the sense that you end with a question, right? There isn't an answer, really.
True. We begin and end with these series of questions from a sort of common man who comes on, who is compelled to tell this story and is, as in a moment in his life, wrestling with these quite critical questions of what is our responsibility? Do we have a duty to do anything when we see the world as it is? So it is offering a quest, kind of.
And when this production is surrounded at every point by student feedback, as Derek said, and also, it was originally, I think the students were on the stage in an early version of it, actually talking to the professor. So what are you getting back from students? I mean, what kind of answers are they giving to this question? I'd love to hear from both.
Yeah, no, that's been one of the most exciting and constantly energizing parts. We've had now several courses, I guess really 4 at Georgetown, that have four different cohorts who've been deeply engaged. One graduate cohort on a course that was really about curricular design related to the production, and then 3 groups of undergraduates, and they're very interdisciplinary. So these are students coming not just from the arts, but from politics, but also from like the nursing school and from the business school. So very, and I think that it's gratifying. We're not having to work too hard for this story to reach them in a very visceral, direct way. So they're starting with an emotional response. I think, I think part of what is interesting is I think that the rhetoric, as David's saying, of the piece, it's very clear that it's putting the questions about responsibility, as Karski did, in their hands. So they may not have answers yet, but they're no longer students sitting on their haunches just going, what do we do? They're starting to be like, oh, this is going to be up to us. And so, David often talks about, and this feels very Karski-like to me, in the same way that Karski says, great crimes start with little things. You don't like your neighbor, but it's in a similar way that we start the sense of agency also starts with little things. Like you can't change the world, that's starting to build a life that's conscious about your own agency and the choices you're making and the values and the positions you're putting yourself in. And that's about remembering, that's one of the things the students on stage spoke about last night, remembering not just in a paying homage way, but the active sense of remembering not only what can happen, but like applying it to what is happening in so many circumstances around the world. So I think it's just about them starting to grapple with and take ownership of their own sense of citizenship and of around these kinds of questions.
Since you mentioned it, I was very struck last night. I went to the student preview by the young woman who said that she had been in the sort of she'd been kind of the COVID epicenter. And when she came to tell people what she had been through, they kind of didn't get it. And she said she felt seen by Karski, by Karski's struggles with dismissal and disbelief. And that completely astounded me. I am just curious if either of you could think of things students have said, responses they've had that really surprised you, that were really new.
I think that's a great example of one that Amina Satterall said from the stage last night. I think that I can think of a couple. I think that it's interesting that, one of the things we've been doing a lot of work at that may not seem like an obvious application of the Karski story, but is around climate. And a lot of the students are very invested in questions around, and I think there's something about human beings' capacity to ignore what is not convenient and to deny that is becomes part for young people and the world they're inheriting, filled with so many challenges, and the people's ability to, as Karski, to sort of just sit on the bench and watch it pass by without actually doing anything. So that's one application that's come up from several students that may not seem like an obvious one, but in terms of their own sense of how to, how to not just feel powerless and on the side.
There was one girl who, I really believe this was in Chicago, or it may have been in DC, and one of the talkbacks, who way up in the back, and she got up and she literally asked, or she gave a little bit of a preamble to what she was going through, having witnessed the show. And she literally asked, "What can I do?" In a very emotional, kind of frank, sharing way. She was just very vulnerable there. And there it is in stark evidence that if we can activate that, then that's the most rewarding thing we can get from this play.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel, so you hear things coming back from students that you don't feel you put into the play? I mean, are there things that are completely new?
Interesting. I can't come up with anything readily. I don't know. Can you, Derek, that they've come up with?
I think that because the play intention, I think that they're applying, a lot of the students have applied to, just to the kind of the moments we've been living through around racial reckonings in this country, and their own sense of the sort of living through that and what are bearing witness to and how it affects them. And we've had students, we had an amazing student from Rwanda in the class who applied his own sense of inheriting a genocide in his life as part of his kind of his own historical psychic inheritance, but having never really had a window into what this Jewish Holocaust was. It felt very European, and so that this became a way to start to kind of create some bridges in his own understanding. So I think those are things that we hope by creating a framework that asks the audience to say, this is your story, as you're our scene partner, you're our interlocutor. I think it allows students to not just to kind of come from the place they are and their own their own journeys and apply it without us having to be too anachronistic, or we don't have to name those things, because we're really asking them to bring those things to the table.
Excuse me, Amy. It sort of wakens. They have almost more skin in the game than we do, and they don't realize it until perhaps they see this, and whatever tributaries, whatever conduits to what they're going through that this play shines the light on. That they sense, oh, I do have agency.
It's interesting.
And it can go this way or this way or this way. So it's quite exciting that way.
I also think there's something quite remarkable for them about, the fact that Karski was in his 20s when the entire, when he sat with Roosevelt at the end of what really is the sort of action journey of the play and all these experiences. He's 28 years old. And so I think experience of how David enacts the story. I think as opposed to an evening with an older gentleman looking back on things, that there's something about the physical life of the storytelling and how cinematic and visceral it is. And the fact that in fact, it's moving us through the chronicles of a young man in these situations that I think is part of where the empathy and directness hits them, as opposed to just, oh, I've heard lots of story, it feels like, I think that's part of the form of the play that ends up, giving us access to their vulnerability in a way, to their emotions.
Mm-hmm. Just to step back for a moment, I mean, you've talked about having a background in Holocaust education, and Moment just recently did a big cover story takeout on the history and the state of Holocaust education today, and we noticed a lot of the early pioneers said that their main thing was to teach people not to be bystanders. That it was this whole idea that it was on them to some degree. But just to take the other side of this, I mean, Karski was sort of the opposite of a bystander. He acted, he suffered, he endangered himself in so many ways, and yet he felt he failed. How do you deal with the other current in this story? I mean, there's a real undercurrent of despair, and there's a lot of suicide in this story, and you're dealing with college students here. How do you manage that side of it?
Really good question, Amy. How do we manage that? I don't know as we've implemented any particular way to manage it, but it's really great that you bring that up, because the 35 years of silence,
right,
is very significant, very relevant, and possibly recognizable to a lot of people. That when you are, as we have put into the prologue, paralyzed with futility, I feel that is quite that's out there in our world today. How do you move beyond the horrors, the despair, the futility? Can you even make a scratch on the mountainside of what you would hope to do to make things good and better? That's it's a really strong phenomenon that underlies the play. It's one of the things about Karski that it remains a mystery to me. There are many reasons that he may have, or why he was silent, but I think that's a really resonant question. It's something we haven't really directed, we've dealt with directly. I mean, Derek, and with students, I'm sure you've had more contact than I have with the audiences, but that's really, that's a great question, Amy.
I'll say that I think it's a really important question. I think that's part of why we felt we needed the kind of depth and care that comes from a curricular approach. And we have a team. It's not just the artists. We have wonderful colleague Ijoma and Jaka, who is co-teaching the course with us. And it's because exactly that, if you're going to do this work seriously, then there is despair and ask students to apply it. It can't just be like, look, it's great. Like you have to be able to go in to what is really to hard conversations and what can be harrowing. And I think that part of what a curriculum and a deeper dive provides, and we've really, that's what we try to do with the Lab for Global Performance and Politics, is to create a space where it's more than you can just get from a post-show discussion, where the kind of that deeper journey of self-reflection can happen, and there can be space and support for the kinds of things that might surface in that. And that does, I think that's part of, we have, some methodologies that are actually about the dialogues after and the conversations and the space that those can come. And I think that's part of, it changes a little bit the dimension from just like we're we're a production presenting a play, and here's a response mechanism in a one-to-one way to actually really creating a deeper frame. Some of the, like the students who were on stage last night, we worked with them 2 or 3 years ago in that course. It feels very, it's not just like they had that experience and then moved on. They're almost now ambassadors for the story who are continuing to apply it. So I think that's part of the kind of deeper relationship building that we hope will happen. And you're right, it's not just all, we can't just facilely say, I think there's hope in the story because Karski is, I find a very inspiring figure, but we also have to acknowledge and reckon with the sense of failure and the deeper, harder questions that this story surfaces about the present moment, and be ready to kind of grapple with those with students and with audiences, I think.
I guess in some ways, acknowledging how difficult this kind of thing is, how difficult it really is to do something, is a way of taking it seriously, right? You're not being unrealistic.
Exactly.
I didn't mean to drive the conversation in a depressing direction.
No, but it's important. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Derek said, that I think it's the gift, or the one thing that an artistic engagement can do, particularly a play, which is a live event, when you're reckoning with things such as what we've been describing, despair and hope and moral courage and silence and paralysis and futility, all these things, that's plays can not only be reflections of what did happen, but which in a way is a rehabilitation of trauma, of people who've been through trauma. They can recognize what they've been through and feel that they're not alone. But it can also be, and with students, it can be a preparatory device to say, well, this is the road you're embarking on, and this is the minefield that you might come in contact with. And so much as the Greeks did when they were doing their plays for the citizen soldiers who returned from the war, they were not only reintegrating and rehabilitating them, but they were also preparing the young hoplite soldiers who were about to go to war with, this is what you're going to confront. And so that's, I think, possibly one of the ways we hopefully are offering young people some kind of preparatory, a map.
Right. My impression was that they respond as much to his pain as to his heroism. That they relate to the pain he's in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So have you worked in the course of this long 7-year journey? Have you worked with a lot of survivors on this, and what do they think of this all?
It's a great question. We've had interactions with some at sort of moments or events where the show is shared and there's discussion with them. We did an event when the show was running at Chicago Shakespeare. We did an event with the Holocaust Museum in Skokie, for example, and that was part of it. But I think one of the 7 years is kind of misleading because a lot of that was sporadic in development, and then just as the show premiered, COVID hit. So it's still actually quite a new play in front of audiences. We had these 2 short runs, DC and Chicago. So a lot of that, we've had these campus engagements and looking deeply with, but it hasn't really had a wide public yet, which is sort of the circumstance of it. And I think that's the moment. And then, of course, the other thing, I had done several projects where the survivor community were really integral to. I had a touring project about the Holocaust that was programmed to be, we had survivors talking at every performance. But the other thing, just to name that will be obvious to this audience, is how, that's a dwindling community of those two kids. But there have been some really critical people and voices, some friends from the Holocaust, Al Munzer, was a child survivor who works there, who's been a great friend to the project. So there've been some kind of key voices along the way who I think have just, helped us, just provide some a deeper framework, and then also who are resources for the students, which is just another type of voice and another type of lens. So that's been important.
Mm-hmm. David, do you want to say anything about interactions with, I mean, have you, I was at one of those moments last year where a survivor, it was in the audience and you know, made some very...
At Shakespeare Theater, yeah.
Yes, made some very
many times, certainly with our audiences, people have stood up and recounted their own, you know, personal experiences in relationship to the story. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's kind of the beauty of the event, is that people feel free to share. This is a safe place. The theater, and if the play has been a catalyst for them to share something that they may have been carrying, some kind of burden, it's wonderful because it engages everybody at the same time in that experience. And there's something, I think, quite healing that when you feel that when you feel it's okay to share some deepest fears and despairs and hopes and, like, you know, your experiences. I think for me, it's always quite moving and rewarding at the same time. But it's as I said, there's more people out there that have skin in the game than certainly there are on stage.
I think that you're working with and among survivors for so long, we were very attuned in creating this to the potential, you know, the sort of wariness that exists around some Holocaust representation and the potential for it to re-traumatize or just be sort of exploitative or overly naturalistic. And I think we were very part of what we hope to do with the show, as David's kind of getting at, is to provide a kind of safe, sacred space for a communal memory that has, you know, it's not that we don't take people to some difficult places, but there's a sort of attempt to do it with a kind of gentleness and grace that is really, really inclusive. That then I think is part of why we've had the experience of quite a few people maybe who came in with some wariness about how the story might be told, feel like that there is a play, there's appreciation, I think, just because of, and I think a lot of that is us just being true to Karski, honestly. Like it's just being true to the sort of particular eloquence and grace and gentleness of the way he thought about dialogue and space. And so by honoring that, and I think David's extraordinary performance has a huge amount to do with this, is that there's a sense that people feel like, oh, a space has been kind of created for me. So we do have a lot of this, and this might have a survivor community come up and say, thank you for creating this space, which for them has felt maybe different than other Holocaust plays or material that is maybe less Socratic or less dialogic, and just maybe has a different approach. We don't show images, that's very intentional. We have a projection design, but it just has the clip of Karski. We're not moving people through visual imagery. It's all through Karski's testimony so that's, I think that's been an influence on how we've created the play.
Just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting that there was anything at all exploitative about your use of history.
Oh, no.
Far from it. It didn't come across to me that way at all. I wanted to ask a related question though. Another thing a student said last night that I thought was interesting was the student had taken the class and had seen this during COVID there's a film version, which I know the chat is filling up with questions about where people can see this. So we'll get to that. But this person made a comment about how different it was to see it in a theater space communally versus seeing it in person versus seeing it on a screen. And it made me think about this thing you alluded to earlier, which is the fact that the survivor presence, the survivor generation is, not going to be with us that much longer. Is this a way of carrying that presence a little bit into the future? How do you see this fitting into an era without direct testimony?
That's a great question. Yes, how do I respond to that? Yeah, the difference between seeing it as a film by yourself on a small little screen and then being in a room with 100, 250 other people there is something in the very neurological energy in live theater that I think enhances, first of all, an emotive, visceral reaction, but then also if you turn and look to your left or to right around, you realize that there are other people with you, so you don't feel as alone. In wrestling and interrogating this issue. So the film obviously we can get and if it does a modicum of that, making them feel a larger community, that's great. But there's nothing like the live theater to create that sense of communality and sharing.
The immediacy. So just to ease everyone's questions, just to get a jump on this, we'll go back. I have other questions, but do you want to tell people where they can see this now or in future? Is it on?
Sure.
Is it filmed? And if so, where is it available? I think there's some links being put up in the chat, but tell us.
I'm happy to. We're for those who are in or near DC, we're just back on the boards at Georgetown University at the Davis Performing Arts Center just for a limited 2-week run now. So you can see it through May 22nd in Washington live, and certainly encourage people to do so. Then we'll be going as part of a summit to Bilbao, Spain, for a couple of performances there, and then the plan is our next plans are for an off-Broadway run, details to be announced in the fall. So the expectation is that we'll be in New York in September and October. In the meantime, there is a film version that has been shot by our friend and colleague, the Emmy Award-winning documentary producer, Eva Anisko, is producing, and we're expecting the film to be available later this year in sort of limited kind of festival circuit mode, and then to wider audiences by early next year. So stay tuned for details. We shot it during COVID in a studio in Brooklyn over 6 days or so. So it is the stage version, but shot in black and white, and in a kind of studio setting. So we think of it as kind of a companion piece, and obviously a way for people who can't, that the play won't be able to get to everywhere. So it's a way for it to have a more enduring place and be able to be offered to students, et cetera. And then there are hopes. I see things in the chat about PBS and other things. So we think that the film, there are plans in the works for the film to be available over the course of the next 12 to 18 months as well.
So on the current events side of things, I think I read that in present day Poland, the play or the Karski sort of the Karski course was running into difficulties. Is that true? This was done at a time when the Polish government was more open to this kind of depiction than it is now.
Yeah, the film's actually being we have found so far with this project a great embrace, even though obviously understanding the kind of political shifts, whatever the film's about to be shown to students at the University of Warsaw, and we've been they're invited, and there's eagerness to bring the play to Poland, and we're in conversations about doing that. So at an early stage of the development of the play, when it was still an ensemble piece, we worked with students from the Academy in Krakow and did a workshop for a week in collaboration with the Poland Museum in Warsaw. We've got through the Karski Educational Foundation and others, colleagues in Poland who've been close to the project, and we've never experienced any sort of resistance to telling the story there, but certainly we recognize that the conversations around what Karski means and what this history means are shift, and the way. One of the things that's been interesting for us as we've gotten more deeply engaged with people in Poland is to start to understand, and we certainly don't claim to have a full understanding of this, but the ways in which Karski is taught and learned about there, the how he's understood. And so we're very interested to engage next week with students from the University of Warsaw, see how they're responding to this story in relation, which I think will be a very different conversation than it's been with Georgetown students.
Yeah, that's interesting. David, have you been in any of these discussions with Poland or?
Not yet. No, not directly. I mean, when we were there working with the students, they were just wonderful. They were so free and willing to, and just amazing contribution to the piece. But these kind of conversations, no, I haven't yet been into these sort of complicated conversations about what his legacy really is in Poland now. I'm sure it's a multivarious responses for those who knew him, those who experienced the war, those who are now part of another different kind of ideologies that have been bouncing around. But yeah, I haven't yet, unfortunately. Really looking forward to hearing what the students from Warsaw think.
There's a strain that actually speaks to this, perhaps this comes out. Another strain in this I noticed, which you don't, I mean, in Holocaust education, it doesn't always come out in just this way, but there's a very interesting theme in his testimony and in his life to do with Catholicism. There are many references in his to his Catholic faith, and I noticed in the Georgetown setting, it was interesting to hear one of the students say, I'm called in the Jesuit sense by this story to a life of interfaith dialogue and reconciliation. Is that something you're consciously working with? Because is it different? Does it add things to this story?
It gives me a sort of a base level of understanding of of the man. He had an unwavering faith. But as he said in one of his speeches, he said that he too became a Jew as he experienced what had happened to him after he bore witness. He and his wife was Jewish. Poland Norenski was a Polish Jew. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that his sense of faith that was imbued in him and just by his mother, I think carried him through his life. Essentially kept him, it gave him such strength to reckon with what he had gone through. And his faith was a very pure Christian faith, I'm sure. And yet I think it should, and in his mind, I'm sure it covers all faiths, is what the basic tenets of his Christian beliefs gave him, that it would, this kind of, what he did, what he considered his duty and responsibility, stemmed from his faith and his belief in the doing good in the world. And I mean, that's probably the baseline of most faiths. So we try to get ourselves up every day with the thing that's going to carry us through. And he is evidence and proof of that to the nth degree.
I think devotion is a very important word and idea in the play and in the project, and it manifests in different ways. Obviously, there's sort of the specific faith context of how devotion is practiced in the Catholic faith by Karski, but there's a sense of like the questions of the play being about what are about devoting oneself, where does one devote artistic devotion in the sort of context of Pola, and I think just that's a way. So I do think it opens up a space for kinds of, obviously for conversations. We were asking about how students connect, even conversations around allyship across, so interfaith dialogue. But one of the things that comes up a lot for students right now is like, well, how can I, as Karski in a sense is a figure, a Catholic figure who is identified with this particular Jewish history, how can I meaningfully provide allyship or, be kind of part of these conversations? Who am I in those? So that's just I think devotion is a kind of core idea.
So I have one last question, then I guess then I want to open it up. But this is something I've kind of always wondered. One of the things you hear said in the research about righteous Gentiles, or as I used to call them, people who have saved Jews or done these heroic things. You sometimes hear researchers say that when you ask people like that why they did these things, they don't even understand the question. They will say to you, "What do you mean? Why did I do it? What was I supposed to do? Let them die?" I mean, you've inhabited Karski now all this time. Do you buy that? Do you think that's true of people like him?
Yeah, I do. I think that, that question is almost like, why are you asking that question? Because it's obvious. Why do this? Because he considered himself an insignificant little man, but I think he considered himself connected to the human race, if I to put it in crass terms. But that his response, his whatever compelled him in there was so basic and so essential to avoid distinction. Don't dislike your neighbors just because they're different. It's something that we really need to amplify and reinvestigate and re-nurture in a way, is the communality of everyone. And you see somebody in distress, don't walk by. It's hard to pay attention or make an effort at every moment you see some sort of distress where someone needs help. But there's something, I believe, I hope that there's something innate in humans that they will respond without even thinking, because there's a connection there. And so I do agree that, why ask the question, why did you do this? Why wouldn't I do this? And that's sort of an essence to him, how he just committed to it with his whole soul.
All right. Well, Derek, unless you want to add something to that, we can open it up to questions.
No, I think that's great. I know one of the threads of the questions is and I just think it's worth naming that the play absolutely, I think the frame of this conversation is a little more about students because we're having the opportunity right now in the current run at Georgetown to share it with students, and because we've got that kind of curricular piece, but it's absolutely, most of our audiences have not been student-centered, and it's a play that is, I think, meant really to be absolutely for the intergenerational dialogue and the way the play is reaching people who with different relationships to this history is critical. I think the unusual part is that we've really tried to engage younger audiences who aren't normally the standard theater audiences as well, but I don't want to give the impression that it's a student play to our listeners.
Great. Thank you all very much. And I do encourage people who are in the DC area to go see the show. It is through May 22nd. And I put a link to tickets, and they were kind enough to give a discount for people who are part of the Zoom today. So you can do that. A question. You had mentioned that there's a film of this, and people will be able to watch it, just not in the theater if they're not local. Do you have any kind of a conversation guide that is available for people who want to lead conversations following, say, a viewing at a synagogue or some other type of venue?
We will not. I mean, we've been developing around the play, the kind of curriculum and those kinds of conversations, including what we think is going to be a really exciting website that we've been kind of like piloting with the students. That's a sort of, really designed as a kind of interactive conversation guide kind of space. And then we'll have print versions of that as well. And then in accompanying the film, we're developing that, and in conversation with Facing History and other kinds of organizations that we would be partnering with on that. So it's not like ready to share yet, but it will be as that material ramps up.
Great. David, a few people are asking, this is not your first time playing a difficult role. People have referenced Steel Toes that you starred in, and they want to know, where does that come from, your draw to these types of characters?
Well, it's I don't know how to answer. Well, what Amy asked and sort of highlighted, saying why does one react to the trials and tribulations of people, and what can you do? I mean, I just feel that there's it's kind of a responsibility if you to share the stories and histories of people who have contributed critically to to civilization, to our lives at large, like Edward R. Murrow, or even people unknown, like the character in Steel Toes, who was a pro bono lawyer, Jewish lawyer who defended a Nazi skinhead who had killed a restaurant owner, and this is the last person in the world who he should defend, but there's, I think, inherent in pieces that deal with real people, situations that pieces of our history. I think it's what theater can do. It's what literature can do, and especially theater, because it can offer you an emotive experience, an insight into something quite hopefully activating and healing. And there are so many stories out there, but I've been so really fortunate to be given the opportunity and privilege to try to bring the voices of those people and their contributions into present time, so that they can still live, that they can still be part of our collective consciousness.
Thank you. Somebody had written in prior to the program, what did you learn about high-ranking American Jews in your research for this role? Any learning gleaned about why they did not push FDR sooner and harder to act to save European Jews?
Well, yeah, to be quite honest, my research was Karski centric, and I really stayed with him, with his words, with his experience. Yeah,
I'll share that someone who's been a really great resource for our team around some of because that comes up in a lot of the conversations, and who we've learned a ton from, and who has in the book version, who has a piece in the book that addresses this, is Stewart Eisenstadt, has been, who did a couple of the post-show discussions with us, but he has a piece in the published volume that came out from Georgetown University Press, which has contributions from Madeleine Albright and Samantha Power and others. There's a piece from Ambassador Eisenstadt that is provides a kind of window into some of the nuances of, and the kind of convergence of anti-Semitism and other kinds of factors in those moments that I think provide a wider lens, because obviously the scene with Roosevelt is both its own, is very much as Karski shared it throughout his life, but it also is a catalyst for a lot of conversations about the politics surrounding it. And so I would direct folks who are interested in the play to Stewart's insights in the volume, and just in general on that history.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. After the Holocaust, we all became very aware of the phrase "never again," and we talked about being upstanders. With what's happening today in Ukraine, and what can people do? What should people think about history repeating itself?
Well, it does, unfortunately, but we should try to do some kind of forward thinking and preparation to avoid another repetition of what is happening. But I don't know why we are somewhat inept at that as a race. I don't know. And it's one of the reasons we do this, why there are artists out there who are constantly banging the drum about look, 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 remember, remember. This could and is and might happen again. And what is there a prescription to prevent it? It's a really good question. Really, really one of the things that we constantly wrestle with as a species.
I mean, I think that question is I don't think we answer the question by doing the play, but the question is the reason that we continue, like even what it means to bring this play back to Washington and to Georgetown right now, and sort of our thinking about the decisions we're having to make about what, we can't be everywhere, but about the frame, even things like the play has an inner and an outer frame with questions that are of the audience. And that's something we see as a very, David and Clark and I grapple with the right language for that frame based on kind of what is happening. There was stuff that we were sharing in Chicago and DC that felt like actually the questions now have shifted a little bit subtly in terms of what we're experiencing in our news cycle now, and with the kind of the immediacy of that. So, that's, I think we think a project like this in the scheme of the sort of scale of what we're experiencing in the world, we don't have, is small in some ways, but we really hope it's providing a space for that kind of ability to come together and understand how history does repeat itself, albeit with variation, and that remembering is not just paying homage, but it's about like grappling with our responsibilities, like it's the action of how we are implicated and what it is that we can do, whether we're students, whether we're political leaders. We've been fortunate to have access with this play by being in Washington and by some of the community that Karski knew, people like Speaker Pelosi and Ambassador Power and people like that who've been seeing the play. And so that's meaningful for us too, that it's part of those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time, it looks like, has come to an end. This hour went by very quickly. I want to thank you both, David and Derek and Amy, for joining us, and thank the audience for watching. I will send, as I mentioned, an email out that will have a link to the recording. We encourage you to share today's program, and we'll include in that the link to the various programs at Georgetown and other things that Derek mentioned, link to the book, and we will send that out to everybody. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Suzanne, thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you. Take care.